Where do I disagree with Eric? Well, it has to do with peer review. And Eric makes a distinction between peer review and expert review. Let's go through a couple different things. Peer review, expert review, proposal refereeing. All these things should be encouraging innovation, testing, replication. There's other types of analysis that can be used to assess the validity of scientific claims. Open review, transparent review. They all have different pluses and minuses. Let's go through them. Eric clearly is against what we call peer review, and he has a great deal of information to back that up. But I claim and we'll go through that information, but I claim what he's doing is sometimes very harmful to physicists like me, that he's seeking to gain more attention. Remember, he's saying that we deserve more money, more security, less bureaucracy, less DEI. So he's harming, in some sense, the people that he's often trying to help. So I pointed out in a tweet response to him that there's many, many journals in his field of physics, which is what he's operating in now. He's most known right now in the intellectual landscape for his geometric unity theory, which hasn't been submitted for peer review, and that's important, obviously. I listed a bunch of journals, from the Reviews of Modern Physics to Nature Physics to Physics Reports, Annual Review of Astronomy and Astrophysics. All these journals have huge impact factors, the impact factor being the average number of times, typical number of times that a paper in those journals gets cited. Now, for many authors, they might get a paper cited once or twice. Eric and others have claimed that citations are just a way to curry academic favor, to get tenure and get funding. That's really not the case. Not my experience as a professional physicist. Again, Eric's not a professional physicist. He's a mathematician working in the field of finance and other things. But he's not publishing. He's not at a university. He's not a tenure track faculty. It's fine to do what he's doing. The practical impacts of publishing in these journals, all of which I've either published in or refereed for, along with the proposal referee process and other things in academia that we have to do to give recommendations for things like awards, promotions, tenure, those require experts and referees. They're usually supposed to be external. You don't want my PhD advisor to give me a letter of recommendation for a proposal or for a grant request. That's just not fair to other people. And in fact, a lot of times the proposal review now is done blindly. You don't even know who's applying, and the people that submit the proposals, they don't know who's refereeing it. So it's double blind. Think about the bias there. How are you actually going to penalize somebody if you don't know who wrote the journal or you didn't know who wrote the grant application? So let's go through some of the claims that Eric makes and trace the history of peer review from its origins to its current role. And this discussion examines how peer review has influenced the quality and progression of scientific research and its limitations and the challenges it faces in the era of modern science. Eric and I did battle about this on Piers Morgan. You can find that link above again. And I made an analogy that to say that you criticize a professor who doesn't understand the history of peer review, which I do understand the history of peer review, but Eric claiming I don't and claiming others certainly don't, I don't think it's actually relevant to how any modern science is done. I don't think any of my graduate students who are brilliant or work in fields related to what I do or Eric does have any idea the history of it, and yet they're churning out some of the highest quality papers and results that I claim Eric and I can't even match.
Peer review doesn't really begin in physics and in the sciences really until the 60s and much more the 70s. The whole idea of peer review is to keep the laity, the people who don't do science for a living or medicine for a living, out of the review process.
Eric, I'm sorry to say, my academic genealogy goes back 17 generations. Every single one of those people, including my students, I'm now in my third generation. I have graduate students that have their own graduate students. They've all been through peer review. We didn't have Pergamon Press and Robert Maxwell. That is true. Einstein published almost all of his famous papers. They were done by peer review.
So I'm trying to be humble here, and I think Eric should be too. So to say that they are not really doing science because they don't understand the history of peer review, I think that's quite frankly nonsense. But peers were always used in some sense to judge scientific replication. When Copernicus came up with the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, he was using observation, which then he published. Actually, he published on the day he died. Galileo used that information. Kepler used that information. Eventually, Galileo's final book, The Discourse, would be published by Elsevier in the Netherlands. Now, that would later be the same journal house, publishing house, that would purchase Pergamon Press, the same press that Eric quite accurately points out was owned by Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, the disgraced partner in crime of Jeffrey Epstein. I did actually, again, post this on Twitter about how some of the greatest publications in modern history were peer-reviewed, including some of the titanic contributions of Richard Feynman with his co-advisor, John Archibald Wheeler, in Reviews of Modern Physics in 1945. This outlined Feynman's path integral method, hugely influential and also in part responsible for Feynman diagrams or how they're actually applied, and later responsible for his Nobel Prize. Einstein's papers, which had it not been peer-reviewed, would have caused him some great pain because it was the claim that he had made originally in 1936 in a paper that he submitted. It was rejected because he claimed that gravitational waves were completely non-real phenomena that could never be detected. And the referees pointed out, be they experts or editors and asked to do it, they were still refereed. And it wasn't allowed to be published until he revised it. And when he revised it, he showed that he was wrong. He also was wrong in his original theory of general relativity in the prediction of the deflection of starlight by the sun. These things were improved upon correspondence and consultation with peers and other experts. There's many, many examples of this. All the journals nowadays are peer-reviewed. A lot of them are blind peer-reviewed. Again, I'm sticking to physics because that's my field of expertise, but it's also a field where I've done reviews. I've done reviews for these articles, and I've submitted over 200 articles, have my name on it, as either author, primary author in some cases, or contributing author, in terms of also millions of dollars of funding that my colleagues and I have obtained thanks to the expert referee review system, which is a form of peer review. So it started informally back in the 17th century, beginning of the scientific revolution. The very first journals, they're very different than we have now, but they share some common DNA. The Royal Society of London was founded in 1660, and it played a pivotal role in developing modern scientific journals with its Philosophical Transactions, which started in 1665. That journal is considered the first scientific journal, but peer review wasn't really part of the process. But in fact, also, it wasn't only the way that you would get recognition by publishing something written. Although most books, obviously the books by Kepler, Galileo, Copernicus, those are publications. They did get edited, they did get review in some cases, and establishing the claims of priority in scientific claims, like that of Galileo, showing the moons of Jupiter, the craters on the moon as he observed them through his telescope. And even things that were cryptically explained. Galileo did not believe that what he could see with his eyes through a telescope when he looked at the planet Saturn. So he made a cryptic, almost puzzle. He would say things like the highest planet is threefold to establish priority in his claim without actually coming out and saying what the truth was, that planet Saturn had these rings around it. He actually couldn't resolve the rings. But he wanted to get some credit just in case he turned out to be right, that it was a threefold planet, which it's not. By the 20th century, the peer review process became quite formalized. Physical Review, the primary journal in my field, became very much the standard in the mid-1900s. But even before that, you would get articles reviewed by a couple of friends of the editor, typically. Again, that's a form of peer review. It's to say that it has no history in science is just outright wrong. But after World War II, in the 1940s and 50s, the rapid expansion of scientific research and the increase in the number of publications necessitated a more rigorous evaluation process. Peer review evolves to ensure the quality and integrity of scientific literature, which is a core part of science. You can't say that science can be done without replication. If you can't reproduce it, it's just nonsense. And there's a lot of science that Eric and others point out is not reproducible because it makes no predictions, or it makes predictions that can't be tested now. Now, it is true, as Eric asserts, that Robert Maxwell, a British media mogul, played a huge and controversial role in the development of scientific publishing. But it's not quite as big as Eric makes it out to be, and it does dovetail nicely into certain theories about Maxwell and Epstein and how he got his money and all the evil things that he did. In the 1950s and 60s, Maxwell founded Pergamon Press, which published numerous scientific journals back then. It doesn't publish things now. Maxwell's business acumen and aggressive marketing strategies significantly expanded the reach of the scientific journals. He didn't invent peer review, but his influence did help the publishing industry standardize it. Now, is that a bad thing to have peer review standardized? Yes, sometimes bad people can do good. I actually don't know much about Maxwell. I'm sure you guys can correct me in the comments down below on how ignorant I am. But the peer review process was long-standing before. Now, Eric points out there was a huge influx of money, interest, and perhaps scientific standards being instrumentalized by the National Institutes of Health, NIH. Now, the NIH is almost 150 years old, and it's the key funding agency for biomedical research. I have no familiarity with NIH grants. I've never had one. I don't work in that field. But in getting grants for NIH from NIH Medical Biomedical. It relies heavily on peer review, both in the fact that many journal articles have to be peer reviewed, but also the proposals are peer reviewed or peer refereed by other biomedical scientists, doctors, etc. And of course, there's been a huge problem in the late 20th century and early 21st century. Things like the replication crisis, p-hacking, stories like 90% of all scientific papers are wrong. A lot of that comes from biomedical science, which is not Eric's field and it's not my field. And so I think it is a little bit of a red herring. It's true that in the 1960s, government agencies began to provide substantial funding for scientific research, and that required a new and robust peer review system to allocate resources effectively. And peer review became a critical component of the funding, ensuring that taxpayer money was spent on high-quality, impactful research. Now, of course, you'll say, well, there was money sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that was government funding, and that was sent by people within the NIH system, like Collins and Fat. Okay, so that's all true. So do you want your research into the drug that you're giving your daughter, do you want that to be completely tested in a biased, conflicted, and perhaps non-transparent, opaque system, or do you want there to be at least some guardrails on the system that allocates money, which then becomes scientific papers, research, and eventually technology, and eventually drugs and technology that you use in your body? I certainly wouldn't want to live in a world that doesn't have peer review or referee review or external review. In 1965, the NIH made a significant change to the peer review process. This was intended to standardize how grants were evaluated, and these were meant really in reaction to the large increase in volume and complexity of those grant proposals. Now, Eric claims the Pergamon Press established a scenario where you had to get all these journals or else you had an incomplete library, et cetera. So again, completely irrelevant for fields like astronomy and physics, which is the field that he is now a part of, as am I. In other words, there's 3-4 journals. As I mentioned, the top 10 impact factor ones I've all refereed or submitted journals to them. They weren't part of Maxwell's journal. They weren't part of Pergamon Press. They weren't even in the biomedical sciences. So let's separate those two. But it is true they had a more systematic and structured peer review process. Is that a bad thing? I don't think so. Remember, Eric is saying that peer review is effectively destroying science, and it was intentionally done so, as he said verbatim in the conversation with Joe Rogan.
The peer review thing got woven in so that people think that the scientific method and peer review are effectively the same thing, where one is an unwanted infection from the biomedical universe, which had peer review much longer than everything else.
Either it was his intention or that's been its result. I just don't agree. The scoring proposals then had sections that were based on scientific merit, innovation, and potential impact. There were some problems that came about in the 1990s and 2000s where then you had to have broader impact statements, even in my field like physics, and they brought in things like sociology into the National Science Foundation. And we've talked about that, and I have a good conversation with John Screntney coming up on the podcast as well, discussing how that came about in order to kind of glom on to the STEM revolution. There are also things like advisory councils, which considered broader issues such as public health, which Eric claims is not science again. The two-tier system helped to ensure that both scientific excellence and societal needs were considered. Again, you can debate whether this is the best way to do it, but should the public not have its voice heard and have its kind of best interest recognized by other stakeholders? It is a stakeholder. It's funding these agencies. And are they responsible? And by what means do you rank and assess? You have two applications from two different people. Let's say they're both blind submitted. How do you appraise them? You just ask a single editor? Eric claims that having expert reviewers like him, and he goes through, he says, I'm not your peer, Terrence. I'm an expert. I'm giving you an elite review. That's impractical for most cases to have Eric Weinstein review every single NIH grant or NSF grant or publication in Nature or Science. It's just not practical. So we have peers, and it's actually part of our educational system. I teach my students, my postdocs, how do you referee a paper? How do you take things into account? What's fair to say? What's not fair to say? How do you do it dispassionately? How do you avoid conflicts of interest? Citing your own research, scooping them, stealing their information, and applying for another proposal under your own name after rejecting that. And we'll get to that. Those things have happened. So the feedback helps researchers understand the strengths and weaknesses of their proposals and the proposals of people whose work they're refereeing as well. It's part of our educational process. To say it has no place or it's dangerous or it's damaging or it's destructive to science is just not true. And it's not fair to colleagues that I work with, my students, and even myself, quite frankly. These NIH reforms had a huge impact on how government grants were awarded, and it does impact science in the United States. Again, it's not relevant to the physics that Eric and Terrence and I are discussing. So to bring it up, I know it's one of the things that Eric loves to talk about, but again, knowing this history of the NIH and how it created different standards for funded research and formalized peer review, does that lead you to suspect in any way that peer review is damaging or dangerous? Or do you believe that it's actually crucial for a scientist, a physicist, to understand the role of Pergamon Press, the NIH, 1965 Welfare Act, that these things are important for a physicist working on gauge theories or working on Lorentz invariance violation, are trying to ensure the objectivity in their own research, to not know the history? It's like the old joke about how scientists need historians of science the way that birds need ornithologists. It's of course interesting, and if you're a Renaissance person like Eric, it's something of great interest and an import, but to the actual workaday scientist, he or she doesn't need to necessarily know that in order to create research and write a publication that can be followed, methodically followed, that's transparent and accountable when he or she submits it to either their dissertation committee or to a journal for publication, so that another competitor team can challenge them and go through their methodology and hopefully replicate it. And if not, then we have a big problem, and that should be retracted. And I agree, we should have a budget. I've actually claimed this in my first book, Losing the Nobel Prize, get it here in the link below, that we should reserve some amount of funding, maybe 10% of the budget, for retracting claims that we make that turn out to be wrong. Because to this day, I get people that come up to me and say, oh, you invented bicep. Well, that was the experiment that discovered inflationary gravitational waves. No, we were disproven. We made an incorrect claim. We're still trying to do that great result, but it was wrong. So, but it was on the front page of the New York Times when we made the announcement, and then when the retraction came, it came 6 months later on page B17 of the Saturday edition that nobody reads. So it's important to reserve some of your budget, some of your attention for scientific ethics to be promulgated. We do need to reserve some budget for ascertaining and correcting ourselves when we're wrong. As I did at the beginning of this video, I was wrong about Terrence Howard having no patents. He has at least 11. And nowhere near 97, but at least 11, and I was wrong. Mea culpa. That's part of science. Peer review certainly has a role to play. There are now an explosion of journals that would make Robert Maxwell roll in his grave or in hell, or I don't know where he is right now. But open access journals, which made the articles freely available to the public, has been a game changer for science, allowing scientists in Nigeria to access work we do in San Diego. Having double-blind, single-blind, and open access journals are huge innovations. Now, they're not perfect. I always say, peer review is the worst system except for all the others. And yes, there are predatory journals and pay-to-play journals, journals that have published things that are obviously put out by ChatGPT. In fact, it says, I'm a large language model. And it says that in the abstract of the journal I saw. And some of those have percolated up to, journals that sound kind of similar to very high-quality journals. The astrological journal sounds a lot like the astronomical journal. But these situations do highlight the ethical concerns that scientists usually do ignore. Now, there have been notable examples where scientists effectively were either harmed by the peer review process, manipulated by it, and most famously, two gentlemen, Gallo and Montagnier, with the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus. In the early 80s, Robert Gallo and Luc Montagnier both claimed the discovery of the HIV virus, the virus responsible for the disease AIDS. Now, Montagnier's paper was submitted to Science. It was delayed and criticized in review. After a long time, Gallo published his own findings, leading to a higher profile paper that he had and a huge dispute over the originality and priority of their discovery. The information had some time to leak out. There's questions if Gallo discovered it first, who discovered it first. They eventually both shared the credit, but the controversy highlighted the potential ethical issues due to the timeliness or lack thereof of peer review in the publication process. One thing that I've thought about a lot lately is peer review using things like blockchain technology, where you could publish something like Galileo, instead of publishing the highest planet is threefold. He could publish it on a blockchain with some wallet that each scientist would get, and then he doesn't have to necessarily expose it to public review or peer review even, or competition until he's fully mined the data of its content. So finally, we come to the question of whether or not Terrence Howard's ideas were blown off by Neil deGrasse Tyson. They talk about this at the end when Eric talks about the elite review versus the peer review. And it's true that if you don't have a .edu email address, or actually that's not fully true, .com, a lot of the biomedical innovations come from corporations. They can get published quite easily. Peer review hasn't destroyed science. It's better than ever. The main journals in Eric's field have never been diluted and are stronger than ever. Physical Review, the journal Nature, the journal Science, the Astrophysical Journal, and many other top quality publications where we go to get our credit because this is what we do. Eric, again, is saying that physicists need more money. Well, now he wants to take away not only the fact that we have very little compensation financially, but that the main mechanism of granting credit to a scientist and that we derive our stature from is from citations, H indices. That's the way of the world. Okay, just like a batting average for a baseball player is one way to judge them. It's not holistic. They may be a great fielder. They may be a great spark in the clubhouse, but that's one of the ways that we use. And to use it and say it's basically affecting the scientific aesthetics is actually not fair to scientists. Again, we have to look holistically at what is best for science as a whole. So let me know below. What do you think of this video? What sorts of topics, societal and otherwise, do you want me to take on next? And click here for a link to a playlist of the greatest hits of Eric Weinstein on Into the Impossible.